All right. Hi, everybody. This is John with Murder by the Book, coming to you with another virtual event from my living room. I'm so excited this evening. We're going to be speaking with Emmeline, Duncan, and Kate Lansing about their new books. But before I bring them out, while everybody is finding us from their various corners of the internet and coming to us here on YouTube and Facebook, we make it just a couple of brief store announcements. So first up, we haven't had any issues lately, but if you see any comments that pop on Facebook that say to watch tonight's event, click here. Don't click on those. It's spam. You don't have to give anybody your credit card info to watch the event. You're already watching it. Don't click away to give people your info. I will block them and ban them as they pop up. But I just want to give that as a general disclaimer in case anybody clicks on it faster than I can do that. Also wanted to mention, if you were unfamiliar with it, earlier this year we launched a subscription box service. We've got 3 different plans. We've got one that's sort of the best of the month where we pick a new hardcover that the staff is really excited about. And then we also have one that is Crime Fiction Legends, which is some I don't want to say old classics, but old classics and some contemporary stuff that we think everybody should read that are just kind of really good like hallmarks of the genre. And then the other one that we have is John's Cozy Corner. So every month I pick a mostly first in series. Periodically, I might pick a second in a series if I think you can jump in there. But basically, a cozy subscription box curated by me. Our April one will be going out in the next week or so. So if you haven't subscribed and you still want to and get the April book, there's still time to do that. You can just visit either murderbythebox.com or murderbooks.com, and there's a link in our drop-down menu. I'm sorry for the shaky camera. My cat is climbing on the coffee table on the other side and making my camera wiggle. Also wanted to mention briefly, we've got a couple of other cozy events coming up. On June 26th, we're going to be hosting, Kensington is doing their Cozy Cons virtually. So we are one of the earlier stores that is set up to do it. So we'll be doing 2 panels, one paranormal themed mysteries and one is bibliophile bookstore themed mysteries. So it's going to be June 26th. We'll have some more info about that soon. And then on May 6th, we're going to be chatting with Mia Manansala, Jen McKinley, and Terry Morin Farley about their new books. And so that's going to be May 6th. Also wanted to mention, if you have missed any of our virtual events, you can always go slide through the store's Facebook feed or our YouTube channel and see all of the previous ones that we've done. If you're looking on YouTube, I've actually created a playlist that has all of the previous Cozy Mystery events all in one spot, and also some of our at-home recommendations for cozies that I've done. And last thing I want to do, I want to send out a big thank you to Larissa at Kensington, who helped us get this event set up. It's been really great getting to work with her to bring you guys these cozy events. So thank you for Larissa for helping us get this set up, and thanks to the gang at Kensington for being so supportive of the store and Cozy Mysteries while we have been adjusting to virtual events. So I'm going to get us started this evening. I'm going to bring out tonight's authors. We're going to start with Emmeline Duncan, whose newest book, Fresh Brewed Murder, just came out last week. How are you tonight?
I'm good, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that we can't do this in the store. So hopefully by the time the second book comes out, the world will have righted itself enough that we can actually do in-store stuff and we can have you in the store to sign.
Yeah, fingers crossed, because I would love to visit Murder by the Book again.
So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Emmeline Duncan is the Portland, Oregon-based author of the Ground Rules mystery series, as well as the YA novels written under the name Kelly Garrett. She is a 2020 Oregon Literary Fellow, a board member of the Northwest chapter of the Mystery Writers of America, and co-organizer of the Friends of Mystery's Bloody Thursday lecture series. She's also a member of Sisters in Crime, Willamette Writers, and SCBWI. And like I said, her new book, Fresh Brewed Murder, has just come out. And we're also excited tonight to have Kate Lansing with us tonight. How are you tonight, Kate?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be here. So thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. So Kate's newest book in her series, A Pairing to Die For, came out in January. The first in the series is Killer Chardonnay, and she is an award-winning short story author. Her work has appeared in the Brave New Girls anthology and the Crossing Colfax anthology. She lives in Denver, Colorado, with her husband, daughter, and a pair of chair-napping tabby cat. I'm sorry, and a chair-napping tabby cat named Marple. I wasn't sure whether or not we would see my cat Calvin make an appearance tonight because my mother-in-law is visiting, and usually when there's somebody else in the house, Calvin is like upstairs hiding under the bed, but he's around here, so you'll see his little orange tail popping up as we chat. So for everybody who is watching, if you have questions for Emmeline or Kate, please post those in the comments either on Facebook or YouTube. I'm going to be chatting with them, but we'll definitely leave some time at the end for some of your questions. But so real easy to get into it. Emmeline, can you tell us a little bit about your new book, Fresh Brewed Murder?
Um, yeah, so First Degree Murder is about a young woman who is the daughter of a notorious grifter who is trying to kind of have a straightforward life. And she opens a coffee roaster and coffee cart with her good friend Harley, who's a fantastic roaster. And they're been open a couple days. It's a bit of, there's some protests going on across the street because the pod had been bigger, but that other lot is being redeveloped into a apartment building. And Sage comes into work and finds the body of the developer dead next to her coffee cart. And unfortunately, it turns out that in addition to being dead by her cart, he was also a former target of her mom, and her mother stole a bunch of money from him a decade before.
Perfect. Great. And so, Kate, can you tell us a little bit about your newest book and your series heroine?
Yeah, so A Pairing to Die For features Parker Valentine, whose dream has always been to open a winery in Boulder, Colorado. And so in Killer Chardonnay, she does that. And of course, it doesn't go according to plan. But then A Pairing to Die For picks up a couple months later when she's dating a chef, Reed, whose kind of hip new restaurant is just opened and is doing very well until his parents roll into town, and there's a very unfortunate meet the parents dinner that just goes from bad to worse when Reed's sous chef is murdered later that night, and then Reed is implicated, and Parker sort of has to dive in to try and clear his name.
And so, as I mentioned, we're only 2 books into the series. Do you think that people can jump in with A Pairing to Die For, or do you think that they should start with Killer Chardonnay?
You can dive in with A Pairing to Die For. I was very careful in writing it not to spoil anything in the first book. And that is a challenge, I think, in writing series, is making sure you can kind of catch the reader up, even if they haven't read the first book. And I do think that you can just dive in and read this one. And it won't spoil anything for the first book if you decide to go back so you can dive in and enjoy.
Perfect. Because that's always one of the questions that pops up. So how do you guys, what is a cozy mystery? If we have anybody that's watching and they've never heard the term, they're not familiar with the genre, how do you define a cozy mystery? Let's start with Kate.
Cozy mystery, I usually define as sort of a more lighthearted, humorous mystery for those that like the puzzle of a whodunit, but not necessarily the gore. And, the hot and heavy romance usually happens off screen. And there's usually a hook like coffee or wine or, a knitting store. And there's also usually a cat or another furry sidekick character. So that's usually and a protagonist who's a little bit plucky. And so that's how I would define it. That's usually how I define a cozy. I get that question a lot.
And how about you, Emily? Do you have anything to add?
Well, I usually say it's generally set in either a small town or a small community. Mm-hmm. And also, and it tends to be, narrators tend to be female, although there's the odd cozy with male, that's male led. And, and I usually focus on the fact that it is like, it's the death is usually off screen. It's not gruesome. And it's usually solved by someone's like, how they view their environment and seeing something's out of place. Like, because it's not going to be fingerprints or DNA evidence that solves the crime. That kind of Hercule Poirot, or actually, I guess to be more of a Miss Marple, kind of seeing human nature and seeing why someone. And also, usually, it's figuring out the why of the mystery that in a cozy versus a procedural.
Yeah.
Answer.
So you mentioned, you brought up a good point. Emmeline, your series is set in Portland, and Kate, yours is set in Boulder, Colorado. So many of the cozy mysteries tend to take place in kind of small towns. So why did you guys choose to give your books a more urban setting? Let's start with Emmeline.
Well, for me, I really wanted to set a book in Portland and make it feel like the Portland I know. And a food cart pod seemed like a small community in and of itself. So it gives that kind of small insular setting with a nice cast of suspects, for the murder, while having that truly Portland vibe and feel to it.
Yeah, you totally. Yeah, and I have to say, Emmeline's book is fantastic, and she totally captured that Portland vibe. I was there a few years ago, and I loved all of the weird Portland things that you brought in. It was just fun. It's a great setting. And so I chose Boulder. I love Boulder. I went to school there. I lived there for a number of years. And when I was trying to pick where to set this book, Boulder, it has kind of a quirky vibe to it that I thought would just be really fun. And I do think even in an urban setting, there is a way to make it feel like a small community. You can still kind of have the restaurants and just the cast of characters that's similar and make it feel small, even if it's more urban or more of a city. But my heart's in Boulder, and I just wanted to set it there. The mountains, Pearl Street, rock climbing. There's just a lot to bring in that I thought would be fun to write about.
Yeah, one of my favorite series, the Noodle House Mysteries by Vivian Chen. She does that really well too. They're set in Cleveland, but she uses sort of that, the Asia Village Strip Center where her family's restaurant is sort of that small town. So it's a great way to do that. So what are some of the challenges then of setting a cozy in a larger city? So how is it different to do that? And then also kind of how is it the same as like if you were doing it from a small town? Let's start with Kate this time.
Yeah, I do think it was trying to make it feel small. So introducing Parker and her world. We all have our worlds, and the people, like, she goes to the same coffee place, so she knows the barista and she orders the same thing, and she knows Pearl Street, and she has the things that she does and that exist in her world. And so I guess I kind of tried to bring that in and create that community feel, and along with having family nearby. So Parker's family lives in Boulder as well. And so that was another way to kind of say, oh, look, it's just, just like another small town. Like her brother just walks in for her dinner, for her opening, or just drops by to visit. So I think, but it is challenging creating that. How does everybody know each other, and creating those interconnecting storylines such that it's believable, but gives that cozy vibe. Emmeline, what do you think?
Well, I definitely want to narrow down like my settings, because being in a city, I could set it at 50 different places, but that would kind of make that community vibe would disappear. So I chose like a very couple specific places, to basically have my character like rotate between, like her food cart pod, like she has a roastery, and then like there's like a family bar that she goes to, and there's a couple scenes there. While at the same time like mentioning like she goes to a Timbers game, but I'm not gonna set like important action of the story there. I always set the important action in like very specific places that hopefully each sort of felt like a character of the book in their own right.
I imagine as you get further into the series, that's got to help too, because then you have like different areas of the same city that you can experience. And then that also kind of gets you a little bit around that. How do all of these murders keep taking place in this small town if you're actually not set in a small town, if you're in a big city that people are familiar with?
Yeah, so exactly, because okay.
No, go ahead.
I'll say exactly, because you can like, oh well, we'll just go to trivia night at a different bar, and oh no, there's a death, and you just figure out how to make that work. Where once you've had a death at like every bar in town, in a small town, like who's gonna keep going, right? If everyone dies at trivia night, you're not gonna go back ever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been binging my way through Leslie Meyer's Lucy Stone cozies, which the series is like 27 books long, and I think I've read like 19 of them in like the last 6 months. And what I love about them is like each book completely starts over, like none of the previous books have happened before. So like at one point somebody's like, oh, I can't believe, it's like the 10th book in the series, and they're like, oh, I can't believe that this crime has happened in our small town. And I'm like, 2 or 3 people die like every 6 months in this town. How does nobody notice this? I love it, because they're just like, we're just going to pretend that doesn't happen. It's fine. So you guys both are writing kind of areas that you know really well. Emmeline, you're in Portland, and Kate, you're in Denver, and you guys both live there. So do you think that it's easier to set it somewhere that one that you live and that's real, or do you think it's a little bit more challenging because you don't have as much leeway to kind of maybe make stuff up if you had like a fictional small town? Let's start with Emmeline.
I would say there's a lot of advantages. Like definitely it would be nice with a small town because you can create whatever you need. But at the same time, the city generally has that as well. But I mean, the rail yard, the food cart pod in my book is, that doesn't exist. So it's based on some real life food cart pods, but I was able to create that environment that I wanted for the story. And I would say that, I can keep doing that. Like so far I've not killed anyone at trivia night, but I'm going to go with that idea. Like if I killed someone at trivia night at a bar, it's really easy to pick a neighborhood, and do some kind of play off of like geeks who drink trivia night and set a murder someplace, and then just a matter of figuring out how to make sure that my cast of characters have a reason to keep interacting with the trivia night group. But there's ways to fix that, like, oh, it's next to like where we have our coffee cart set up for a week because of some festival or something like that. That was one reason I chose a coffee cart, is you can move them. And so I can move to festivals and other places in the future to make things feel fresh. How about you, Kate?
That was really smart of you to do that. That's great. I think writing about Boulder and Colorado in general, it was actually just really fun. There are times when I have to make sure that I'm describing enough for people that maybe don't live in Colorado, like describing what the Flatirons look like, because it's such a just everybody knows what they are here, it's this geological formation, but you have to describe that to people because that's not well known, I don't think everywhere. And so taking the time and drilling in, like, oh, do people actually know what this is outside of Colorado, and having to really be cognizant as I'm going. But overall, I think it's been really fun because in A Pairing to Die For, I talk about Union Station, which is one of my favorite places, and I can't wait to go back there because it's restaurants and it's this old refurbished train station in Denver, and you get to kind of pick these locations that I just think are so cool that I want to elevate and make a character, like Emmeline said earlier, almost make it a character in the story. And so on that level, I think it's really fun to know some of those hidden gems that maybe, let's talk about this right in this book. Yeah.
So then asked, and I'm going to roll this into one of my questions too. So you guys have talked a little bit about settings, but she'd love to know why you chose mysteries when you decided to write. And I also kind of want to know a little bit, like, what was your, introduction to the cozy genre, and what was the thing that made you decide that you wanted to write in the genre? Let's start with Emmeline.
Well, looking back, like, I've always loved mysteries. Peggy Parrish did a series. They're kind of a mystery adventure with Jed, Liza, and I think it's Bill. It's like two brothers and a sister that like have to solve. They go like to their grandparents' like summer home, and they solve like a 40-year-old very low stakes mystery for their family. And I've always liked the sort of the puzzle aspect of books, and I've always read mysteries. Probably when I was in college, ended up reading a lot more literary fiction because I studied creative writing, but I definitely would like read thrillers for fun. And so it kind of took me a while after I graduated to realize, that's actually where you should look, is like the mystery sort of area. And I also, writing wise, the fun part of picking up mysteries was that it was easier to figure out plot from mysteries because there are so many specific elements that happen, and figuring out like red herrings and stuff like that. And so that really helped me figure out that I wanted, like, how to plot a novel, was learning to write a mystery. As far as cozies, it's funny, I remember as a kid, going with my mom, and she would go to like our local used bookstore, and she would buy a bunch of cozies, and she would like sell them back, for like probably like, if bought them for $1, sell for like $0.25 and buy like a whole new stack of cozies. And I look back now and I actually recognize some of the covers of some like really classic cozies. And at some point she gave me like all of her Agatha Christie books, and I read all of those in my 20s. And so it was a really natural kind of fit. And I played around with writing different types of mysteries, and cozies just felt really natural and really fun because I really like the world that they create. And so that was I sort of fell into writing cozies just because it felt probably the most natural to write. How about you, Kate?
Yeah. So I first started reading mysteries with The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler as a child, which was one of my favorite books, and I just loved it. And from there, it slowly evolved, and Agatha Christie, and then I guess in the last decade, just picking up just cozy mysteries that were coming out and just really loving them and enjoying them. Whenever I needed something lighthearted, almost like a chick lit or rom-com, but with murder and that puzzle on the side. And like Emmeline, it just ended up, I dabbled with a couple of manuscripts with YA, and kind of learned how to write a novel that way over a number of years. And those are in a drawer, which will never see the light of day because they're terrible. But then I got this idea when I was working. I worked at a marketing company, actually in statistics. And I had this idea for a cozy mystery that was sort of The Office meets, cozy, Agatha Christie. I thought, well, this sounds kind of fun. Maybe I'll try it. And like Emmeline, it felt really natural, the voice, and I loved it. And that plot, the clues and the red herrings, and it was just really fun. And so that was my intro to writing cozies, that story. And then it was a couple years later, I got this idea for a wine shop owner. And that's how this series kind of came about.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned kind of the world that, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add one other thing, because cozies tend to be so voice driven, and I'm really drawn to reading it, but also writing voice driven fiction. And so I think that's another reason why it was so easy to like sort of fall into loving and writing cozies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you mentioned, kind of the world that they create, because, when you talk with like science fiction or fantasy writers, they're always talking about kind of world building and how they create these big giant magical worlds and magic systems and stuff like that. But, I think mystery writers do that just as much, because you do have to create this world in this town where, people are going to want to come back and revisit these characters again and again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd say like, and not just cozy, I'd say like all mysteries. I think like all novels have world building. Obviously, like a high fantasy is going to have a much higher level of world building than, like a police procedural, but it's always there. And it's, it's sort of fun sometimes to pick up a book and or even like pick up a romance and look at like, how did they actually create the world, even if it's a place, like, even if Portland, like, but how did she make it feel on the page that it feels like a character, even though it does exist.
Mm-hmm.
So for both of you guys, you cozies they're basically for any age group. But what we really love about them too is they're really good kind of bridge books for teens who are potentially, have read everything in the young adult mystery section, and they're ready for kind of adult level reading, but maybe sometimes not adult content, or parents are a little squeamish about a mystery being too graphic or stuff like that. We found that cozies end up being really good bridge teen books too. But so while they're for any reader, both of your books kind of tend to be catered a little bit more towards kind of millennial or older Gen Z population, with your characters being younger. With Emmeline, your character owns a coffee truck, and Kate, yours owns a winery. So why do you think that locally made kind of breweries, microbreweries, wine shops, coffee shops, things like that are so popular with kind of younger people, and why did you decide to give your sleuths those careers?
Oh, what a good question. I love that.
That's from Larissa. She gave me such good questions. So I'm going to give Larissa complete credit for that one. So
great question, Larissa. I think there's a movement right now towards that sort of the locally made, locally sourced goods. And, I think for my book, I wanted it to be, a bulk of it is about dreamers. And I do think millennials are a generation of dreamers. We have these ambitions, and have these side hustles that we're working on. And I wanted to tap into some of that. And I did think winemaking, Boulder actually does have a number of wineries like Parker's, where the grapes come from Grand Junction, She doesn't own her own vineyard, but she has her winery. And I just thought that would be such a hip young thing. And for a while, even in my 20s, I had this dream, for a little while, until I realized how much work it would be. And that's the great part about writing, right? You can vicariously experience some of these things that you dreamed about. And one of mine was, gosh, it would be fun to try and make my own wine someday, So that's kind of how I would answer that, I guess. That's a really good question, though. I'm going to be thinking on that one.
Well, I think for me, because Portland has a very strong DIY sensibility, and there's so many like micro roasters and people kind of following their passions and creating like a food cart, or they work as a barista, but they some kind of esoteric art maker in their side. And, and we have a lot of like really cool stores that sell like locally made stuff. It just feels like such a key part of the world I'm in. And that's one thing that sometimes when I travel that I remember, like Portland, we have very few chain restaurants in the city proper, unless they're like local chains. And I forget that people, sometimes I'll travel and like I see like just like all chain restaurants, and I forget that's a different sort of style, like in the world. And so for me, like setting at a coffee cart, it felt very authentic. It's like felt like something that I would find in Portland. I really love coffee, and it's something I think a lot of people they like, and that kind of like third wave coffee trend, although arguably we're in fourth wave, is something that people I thought would respond to and would enjoy. So just sort of it felt again like a really natural area to go into, and very authentic.
One of the things I love about the genre, Kate, you mentioned this, with kind of younger people being dreamers. I love the fact that so many cozies tend to be kind of one of the tropes of the genre is you have, a woman who has just gotten divorced, or she's broken up with her boyfriend and she's moving back to her hometown. And I really love how the genre tends to use kind of that moment as a catalyst to get this person kind of shake up their life. And inevitably they go back to their small town and they get to do something that they've, dreamed of for years, whether it's opening a bakery or a wine shop. And I love that like the genre basically lets these women kind of do this on their own terms. And I think it's something that the genre doesn't get enough credit for either.
Oh, I love that. It is really empowering for these protagonists.
Well, I think of most books, there's an element of like wish fulfillment. I mean, because think of like when Tom Clancy, like in his heyday, there was that kind of I'm gonna go save the world fulfillment. And in cozies, it's the same kind of wish fulfillment, but in a smaller scale. Like I love making tapestries. I'm gonna turn it into a career and be successful. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of research did y'all do into the hooks for the book? So into like owning a coffee cart and owning a winery. Let's start with Emmeline. So how did you figure out kind of the day-to-day mechanics of what that would look like for your character?
Well, I did it in a couple different ways. On the coffee side, I mean, I played around with roasting my own beans. I did work in a coffee shop in college as a barista. I have a bunch of different ways to brew coffee. So I played around a lot with the act of making coffee. I talked to different roasters, also baristas. Like, I go work in a coffee shop, and if it's slow, people are really happy to talk about what they do and, and their job. And then I also, when I first had the inkling of the idea, there was a coffee cart down the street for me. It's since moved into downtown Portland, and my dog and I would walk down, a couple times a week. And it was my dog's favorite thing, like the coffee cart jokes. I actually took a copy of my book to this coffee cart owner the day my book came out. And he was still talking about how he would know I was coming because he would hear my dog barking from like a block away. And my dog would run up and put his paws up on the cart and stand there until he got a treat or two. And so, and that's, my book has suspended coffee boards, and that's actually where I picked up the concept, was from this coffee cart. And, and so I talked a lot about him. His business was new, so he had time to chat. And we just talked a lot about what it was like having a food cart. And I talked a lot with the other food cart owners back then, and just because it was a new pod and sort of what their lives were like as food cart owners. And I've since met some people who like I know a hairstylist who used to own a food cart. And it's just, I've talked a lot about people, like what it was like every day and the challenges and what they loved about what they did. So that's most of my research has basically been around talking to people and getting them to kind of talk about their passions.
That's really cool. On research, right? It's so arduous, these cozy hooks. So I guess for me, I started tasting wine with my husband like over a decade ago. And I had no idea back then when we would go and visit these little wineries and tasting rooms where, again, the owners, like you said, are always willing to answer any questions and share the tidbits about the process and the fermentation techniques. And I just thought all of that was really cool. And it kind of stuck with me. And I had no idea it would turn into research, because then when I got this idea, I was able to just go into this plethora of knowledge I had kind of saved up. And but I will say, for A Pairing to Die For, one of my favorite bits of research I did was and this was pre-pandemic. I was lucky enough to go and do this a few months before. But I went to a tasting room in Boulder. I knew I was going to set this book at the Harvest. But to set a book at a Harvest, you actually have to talk about some of the chemistry that goes into winemaking in the process. And so I actually went to a winery and got a sneak peek in the back, kind of behind the curtain, and got to see a tub. I think it was Pinot grapes in the early stages of fermentation, similar to what turns up in Parker's. And I got to smell the aroma. The entire tasting room, and just from the back of the winery, which is kind of like a warehouse style, like Parker's, that you could just smell it right when you walked in, that jamminess. And, you know, some of those tidbits, I do feel like it's so helpful to go in person, because you get like, wow, that's what it looks like. That's what it smells like. That's what it's cold in there, because that's what the chemistry and all of the chemical reactions needed. And so I got to go and do that. And that was probably the coolest bit of research I did, along with watching so many YouTube videos on fermentation for any questions that lingered after that.
Did you make any of your own wine?
Not yet, but someday, I tell you, it's gonna happen. We've looked at winemaking kits in the past, and it is something I think would be really fun someday.
You could do it as a book launch. Be like, here's my new book and here's my wine. Hopefully it's palatable.
Yes, I love it. And, you know, something fun that I found parallel with books and winemaking. I was talking to the gal that worked at that winery, and we realized that the time it takes for a bottle of wine sometimes to age, you know, from when the grapes are harvested to fermentation to aging, it's about the same as it takes for a book to come out. You know, you come up with a story idea, you write it, it goes through editing, and then it comes out. It was like, oh, look, these are so similar. It takes like 1 to 2 years sometimes.
And sometimes the idea needs to age in a cellar, and you come back to it in 20 years.
Yes.
So on the flip side, we talked about how generally in cozy mysteries, our sleuths are amateur sleuths. They're not working, you know, close with the police. Sometimes there's a police officer and they might share info, but they're not worrying about things like fingerprints and forensics and stuff like that. So what kind of research did you do into the actual crime solving to figure out how much like an amateur sleuth could kind of figure out on their own without needing kind of more of that specific police intervention? Let's start with Emmeline.
Well, I did research what the police would do in a situation. Like I used to play a lot of soccer, and like I talked with a friend who was like a police officer, and she walked me through like in a crime scene everything that would happen, and like how people would be checked into the scene, what the first responding officer would do, when like a sergeant would show up, when detectives would show up, who would be allowed on the scene. You know, and so I did as much as I could, and I have some, you know, books on like police procedural and like forensics, and I did everything I could to try to make sure what I had was accurate, and then ignored like 90% of it. But at the same time wanting it to feel accurate to someone that was reading that knew a little bit, you know. And then I kind of think of it as like the good cozies. It's all about the psychology of the crime, or it's the small detail that doesn't quite fit. It's like trying to do a jigsaw, but you have one piece of the puzzle that's for an entirely different puzzle. And it's when you find that piece that doesn't fit, that's the clue where you're like, and then you know based off what you've observed in people, why the murder happened. I mean, there's probably, you have, you know, multiple suspects, and suddenly you know who is the actual culprit. Mm-hmm. How about you, Kate?
Yeah. So I've done a good deal of research. I'm a member of Sisters in Crime also, and Mystery Writers of America, and I've read a lot of books about police procedure that are written for writers. If any writers out there need those, there's a lot out there, and it's really helpful. And like Emmeline, I maybe don't include all of that. Like you include like 10% of what you research, right? Is like the tip of the iceberg, but it's enough to ground the reader in reality and to make it seem like this could actually happen. Or it would actually go this way. But I really love the way Emmeline said it. Like it's the why sometimes in cozies more than the how. And there's always that piece that then falls into place, and maybe the main character realizes the motive, you know, or realizes, oh, you know, or just realizes that one puzzle piece. But it's not necessarily fingerprints. Although I do think it's really important to do that research, because I think in cozies, you know, you have to suspend a little bit of your disbelief, but you do want it to seem real when you have the police and the detectives there. But yeah, it was fun trying to include enough of that, but not overdo it.
And not drown the reader in like the kind of like police details that won't matter in this story.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so since we've mentioned it, no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, I feel lucky I also know a couple attorneys, including a former public defender, who will answer my like random questions and not be like, are you going to commit a murder? She's just happy to like answer, and like, what charge would someone face? Or like, could they, get in and out of, like, how quickly would they be processed in jail and stuff like that.
One other thing I did, I actually went to Boulder County Jail and I got to sit through an arraignment. That's something, like, there are so many resources available if you ever are for writers, and they were so open. I cold called the sheriff's office and just said, hey, can I get a tour? There are things that there are no photos online of the interior of Boulder County Jail for, probably very good reasons, but I was able to go in person, but that helped a lot with some of those scenes. Yeah, so it's helpful to have an in, I guess.
So I wanted to mention, since we brought them up, so if there are any aspiring writers out there in the Houston area, we do have a Houston chapter of Sisters in Crime who, before the pandemic started, they actually met at the bookstore, I think maybe once or twice, and then pandemic happened, so they've been meeting virtually. But we have all of the info about their upcoming events on the Murder by the Book website. So if you just visit the store's event calendar, it's usually the third Sunday of the month, and it has all the details there where you can join in and watch their meetings. So if anybody is in the Houston area is curious about Sisters in Crime, we do have our own local chapter, and we're excited to be able to welcome them back in the store once we're able to do in-store stuff. So we've got some really great crowd questions that are popping up. So Larissa said that she wasn't sure whether or not she wants a cup of coffee or she wants a glass of wine. And Bryce has decided that he and Trisha are now going to go to a coffee shop and then a winery this weekend. So you guys are making everybody want to get out into the world and go experience coffee shops and wineries. And Emmeline, Bryce wants to know if you could tell us where you got that awesome Drunk Unicorn wine bottle holder that's behind you.
It is amazing.
I think I actually got it from the Evil Empire, Amazon, but a friend of mine had one and I saw it and I'm like, I absolutely also need a Drunk Unicorn. And so she sent me the link.
Awesome. So Trisha wants to know, I'm going to get adapt this for both of you. Emmeline, she wants to know, what's the most enjoyable part of being able to switch genres between cozy mysteries and YA?
The part that I like is that cozies have a specific, the criteria of, the amateur sleuth and not being too bloody. Romance, is very light. I mean, and anything gritty will happen like off screen for both, and violence and romance. And, YA has its own set of requirements, right? The narrator tends to be a teenager. It's never an adult looking back. It tends to be very in the moment. Teens, when you write about them, you're writing about a lot of first experiences. I mean, as mystery writers, it's their first, death they dealt with, but it's also their first heartbreak and maybe the first time they've lost someone, or like in The Last to Die, it's the first time they created a burglary ring that goes terribly wrong. And those emotions and the immediacy of the emotions is very different than how an adult processes things that happen. And so it's really fun to put myself into an entirely different kind of like built up world and like, okay, what story can be told within this viewpoint and how to make it feel, accurate. And it's just really fun to jump between the genres and sort of stretch myself in a new way and then be like, oh, I want to take a break, write a new story and go back and forth. It helps me feel like I'm keeping my writing fresh that way. And I know Kate has been playing around with more than simply cozies, so she might have a good answer as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask Kate, so since you've done short stories and cozy mysteries, and you said you had done some other stuff too, can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. Well, boy, short stories. Now that's a whole other world. And I think that is so fun because it's almost like a quartet versus a symphony is the best description I've heard. And it so helped me learning to write novel length by writing short and concise and creating a whole story arc. And that has its own challenges there, making something a small enough scope. Cozies, I think there was more room for voice. Emmeline talked about that too. I think that, cozies with a mystery and the protagonist and having all of the rules of the genre it was fun to play in that. And like Emmeline hinted at, I'm working on a young adult contemporary mystery right now, just for something fun and different. I just turned in book 3 of Parker of the Colorado Wine Mystery series. And so I kind of thought, hey, let's work on something different for a little bit. And that's been really fun because you can stretch yourself a little bit and do slightly different things. And like Emmeline said, it's a lot of firsts with YA, which is something I've always loved about that genre. And I am playing a little bit with narration and just, keeping things fresh, and we'll see how it goes. It's fun to be, it's fun to work on something a little different, change gears every once in a while, and a fun challenge.
And one thing that I think is really fun with the best YA tends to be a really nice mix of plot and character development. Because sometimes with mysteries, it goes really heavy into the plot side. And then some is like novels for adults, it's like really heavy onto the character side. And the fun thing with YA is that it tends to be very well balanced between those two. And I think that's a really fun skill to work on, and then bring that back, into cozies and other projects.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing a rare non-mystery read for a book group that I'm in. It's the first time I've done like a book group thing, and we're reading a literary novel. And I'm like, oh man, I could tell I've been reading mysteries for so long, because like I really need them to stop telling me what all these characters are thinking and feeling, and I need something to happen.
It is fun. The mystery is it's all a lot of external plot, and it's always interesting when you try and do. Those are some of the hardest scenes for me to write. I don't know about you, Emmeline, but some of the internal, slower paced ones, I'm always like, oh boy, how do I bring more tension in here? Like, where's another body when you need it?
Yeah, how do you write those internal scenes in a way that feels compelling, but at the same time you need them so the reader has a chance to sort of catch their breath and feel grounded and care about what's happening on the screen or on the book page.
Totally. It's all a balance.
So Kate, you wrote a really great article for Crime Reads, and paraphrasing, you say that cozies have a reputation for being about older women snooping into crimes and have an older readership. So what do you guys think about that misconception, and how do you think that cozy mysteries are there for all readers? And if anyone's interested, I'm going to link that Crime Reads piece in the comments here if y'all want to check it out. So let's start with Kate.
Yeah, well, thank you for calling that out. I think the misconception that cozies are so much more, and I think especially in the last, I don't even know, like maybe last few years, I keep seeing just the genre broadening more and more, including just all sorts of different narration styles, different cultures, just really becoming more than what I think it initially started out as. And I think it's really exciting and it's really fun. And I love Miss Marple. Like, don't get me wrong. I love my older gals snooping, but I do think it sells the genre short a little bit, especially right now as we see more and more cozies coming out that are pushing the boundaries and saying, hey, there's different stories to tell and different voices to be heard here. And I think it's awesome. I love what I'm seeing.
Well, I think a key part of showing that the genre has like such a broader appeal is, having a broader mix of voices and getting away from being always like a divorced woman in her 40s starting over, which, I mean, that stereotype came to exist because for a while that were a lot of books that were coming out. And it's, it's important to still have those, but just keep having that like a really nice mix that will appeal to like a wide group of people. And it's interesting, so I'll have friends that like haven't read a cozy mystery, and I'll recommend a few. I'm like, no, really, try this or that, and then they tend to like it, and it's because they just didn't really think to pick it up, when they've been generally picking up whatever the really hot, like, newest fantasy novel is, and then they're like, oh, this is kind of refreshing and fun. So.
Yeah, and I think there is a spot for like, Gillian Flynn, Gone Girl, just off the top, like her book was fantastic and it was all the rage. And so I think there was this huge drive for more mysteries and more thrillers. And I think cozy sometimes, like, especially during the last year when people needed something, they wanted that, like that puzzle again, but without that really high stress book. And I think there's a lot of people that are slowly starting to see the genre as more than what it always has been.
Well, I know a handful of people that after they had their first child, they couldn't read like gritty mysteries anymore. But like a friend of mine reread all of Donna Andrews' books while breastfeeding her son, because they were comfortable and they're well written, they're really fun, and there was that murder in the puzzle, but she didn't want to think about life being too dark, right, while she's like holding her new baby. And I thought that was an interesting sort of idea too, of how people's tolerance towards violence will change over their lives, and when cozy will be especially appealing versus when maybe a grittier novel meets the need.
Yeah, it's been great to see kind of also like kind of the prevalence of everybody loving like it's Christmas time. We love these like kind of small town Hallmark Christmas movies. It's been really fun to see people that come in and they love that. So that's kind of one of my shorthand things for cozy sometimes. Is like just think about like a Hallmark movie in this small town. There just happens to be a murder that happens off screen. So it's been really great to kind of see the rise in that also bring younger readers to cozies as well.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you guys, as we said, there's kind of new voices and you can play with the genre a little bit. So as a writer and you're playing with the rules of a subgenre like cozy mysteries, how do you know how far you can kind of expand that and kind of push the boundaries of it while still making sure that you're staying true to kind of what people are going to like recognize as a cozy mystery and have that feel to it?
That's a good question.
I would say like, I mean, and that's probably something that you, maybe the first draft, you maybe would pay less attention to and just sort of write the story. And then, when you come back to edit, be like, is this pushing things too far? Or like, I mean, because I mentioned like a teenage girl that's homeless in my book and figuring out like, what are the parts of her life that, except I don't want to shy away from things that might be difficult, but but how to phrase things or how find a point to put on like her experiences, like should I include in the book? And I think that's just, I mean, that's a line that we just, it's hard to work through, but we just do. And I think once you read a bunch of cozies, I think you also get a kind of the sort of innate sense of like where that line is. And I think the biggest way to develop that sense is literally just going and reading as many cozies as you can get your hands on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice. I think reading cozies is the best way to start being able to tell where are those lines, where are those boundaries, and it does for me. It happens throughout. I outline first, and I kind of make sure, well, is this too heavy for a cozy? And I kind of play with different plot lines or different subplots and different plot lines, and if I do want to include something a little bit heavier, it's how to make it through Parker's point of view, maybe be not so intense that it drives the traditional cozy readers away. And I don't know, I'm always having to back off. Like I laugh. I don't know why I have more swear words in my first draft than anywhere else. And I find that I delete like 2 in every draft until like, okay, now there's finally an acceptable amount, which is pretty much none in cozies. But there's all of these different things that kind of, I think as the manuscript evolves, it will become more cozy. And like one thing I love, my editor is amazing and I've loved working with her. And one of my favorite tips she's given me, and the only one she hasn't said this on, is book 3, which means I added enough cats. In the first 2 books, she's like, we need to just elaborate these scenes with Zin. Let's just really dig in here. Let's have Zin in more scenes. Like, you got it. I love writing about cats. But like very seriously, I think that's an important part of cozies, and it does help give it more of a lighthearted feel. And it is giving the readers what they want.
So as a reader, what is your favorite cozy trope? Let's start with Emmeline.
That's a good question. Did you ever read those? There was this, it was like a DIY how to write your own cozy description that went out. I think it originally on the Dorothy Sayers list, and it's hilarious. And it's basically the plot of every cozy, and they're like, so your character comes to town and she's either like a Morris dancer, coffee shop owner, dominatrix, has this passion, mentions like the police chief who has, moody gray eyes or sparkling emerald or, something. And it goes through all of the kind of the stereotypes, which was actually really valuable to read because I reminded myself, like, what are the tropes and then how to like finesse those, right? So like maybe acknowledge them in the book, but without hitting them in hopefully a cliche way. And I don't really know what my favorite would be, other than I kind of like always having the police, like the skeptical police officer who is never a love interest in my books. But that's kind of fun, of having like someone who's like, what, I just stumbled across a body, and the detective being like, did you kill them? Are you sure? Because you found him, and like that's your box cutter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you, Kate?
Oh boy, this is a good one. I'm such a sucker for the grand unmasking at the end. I love a really dramatic aha moment, And I like it when I read, and like Murder on the Orient Express is the best example I can think of, where Hercule Poirot gathers everybody around and then slowly eliminates, well, it wasn't you, it wasn't you, it wasn't you, but then of course, I don't want to spoil anything for the book, but it's always really fun when I just love those. And how realistic it is, I don't know, but that's one of my favorites that I see, is that the grand unmasking, where all of the suspects are gathered around the table and then you slowly figure out who done it.
Yeah.
Have you ever watched Death in Paradise?
I've only seen
Death in Paradise. It has, like, it's really fun. It's basically almost like a cozy mystery locked room with, but police officers on an island. And it's really funny because every episode, like, okay, gather all the suspects, and they have the unmasking where it's like, you think he's like, as if they're like, what, I didn't do it. They're like, oh, I know you didn't. I'm just showing why it could have been you, but it's actually you.
It's the best, right? It's so dramatic.
Yeah, I think my favorite is that, like, that Nest, the character that shows up and is like horrible to everybody by like page 5, and you're just like counting down the pages because this person is like gonna die like as soon as the next chapter starts, and that everybody in town is going to be a suspect because they were so terrible. I think that's my favorite.
That's a great one.
I also kind of love cozies when every evil person in town has died, right? Because by the time you get partway into the series, you're like, oh, all the bad people are gone. How do you get a new victim?
When I chatted with Joanne Fluke in February, the mayor of her town has gotten killed. And she was like, I've been waiting for like 10 books now to kill this character. I was so excited that I finally got to kill this terrible mayor in this town, which is hilarious. So Larissa wants to know, who are some of your favorite cozy authors now? Let's start with Kate.
Oh, I love that. So Lindy Walker is fantastic. She writes more suspense these days, but I loved her Front Page Fatality is the first book in her Headlines and High Heels series. I love Cynthia Kuhn's Academic Mysteries, and she has a new mystery series coming out next year I'm excited about. Vivian Chan, the Noodle Shop Mysteries are fantastic. I love Tasha Alexander for a historical cozy. Her Lady Emily series is one of my favorites. I just love that she has such a feisty feminist heroine. And then, Emmeline's book was fantastic. Can I just do it? It's sheer. I loved that, the hip, young feel of it. And yeah, I could just keep going. I'll let Emmeline say a few though.
I've been a fan of Donna Andrews for years. I really like how her series still feels very fresh, even though she's written them a good number of them. I just had a couple names. A local friend for me, Angela Sanders. I really like her writing a lot. She has a new book, Bait and Witch, just came out, and she also has some other books under like a different name, and they're very good. Kate Ellis, she's an English author. I really like her work a lot. And hers have like an archaeology kind of bend to them. And I'm kicking myself because I just remembered a name that I didn't want to forget, and of course I forgot it. And I also I read both of Kate's books recently, and I really liked those.
Thank you.
You guys have mentioned some of my favorites too. I'm a big fan of the Tasha Alexander Lady Emily's, and the Vivian Chens are sort of my kind of cozy convert books. When people are like not sure about them, I give them the first Noodle Shop one. And Angela Sanders' Bait and Witch was our first pick for the Cozy of the Month subscription box too. So I'm super excited for the new one to come out. And speaking of cozy writers, we have S.C. Perkins watching, who does the Texas Genealogy series, who we absolutely love. She's a regular customer at the store, and we're so excited for the series. But she wants to know, which scene in your books was your favorite to write? Let's start with Kate.
Oh, that's such a fun question. So I'll stick with A Pairing to Die For. And I think there's two scenes that come to mind. But so one of them, I'll stick with this one, which was really fun. And it's a grape stomping scene at the very beginning. And it's sort of Parker is working off some of the pent up aggression she has after the horrible Meet the Parents dinner. And so she goes back to her wine shop, and it's a sort of therapy. She stomps some grapes in a tub, and she's hoping to make it a community event. And then her boyfriend Reed shows up later and surprises her. And they have this really adorable scene that I had so much fun writing, where they sort of slow dance while they're stomping grapes together. And it's sort of like a weird way to add a little romance, but not with but within the cozy realm and within the hug. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of my favorite scenes. to write because it was kind of silly.
One thing that I have fun with, because my character being the daughter of a con artist, she has some grifter skills herself, but she doesn't use them for money. And so like the first book, she like will cold read customers for fun, right? And like pretend to tell their future. And she's so good at reading people and noticing small details that, people kind of believe her. And I play around with that in a slightly different way in the second book. And those are like really fun, and to figure out like, oh, if I was looking at these people, what clues would their clothing or like the keychain hanging on their bag give me about who they are? And so those were just really fun scenes to write. And then I can't say too much without spoiling it, but I really liked writing like the climax of Fresh Food Murder. It was really fun for me, but I can't really talk about it without spoiling why it was really fun.
So Bryce wants to know, do you have any secondary characters that you think might have the potential to get their own series later? And do you have any of those secondary characters that you would like to hang out with? Let's start with Emmeline this time.
Well, I really like pretty much all of my secondary characters, and I tried really hard to make sure they feel like real, vibrant people that have a full life outside of Sage, that my narrator. She and her brother have a really close relationship, and like he's a child advocate attorney, and he's like really grumpy, but he always has her back. And I really like writing their relationship, and I could see Jackson could actually be kind of a funny lead of a novel, because he's like always does the right thing, and he's like always acts grumpy about doing it. And then my character's like business partner, the roaster, would be really like fun to write something from her point of view, because she has a very different perspective than Sage. How about you, Kate?
Yeah, so okay, I have to say one of my favorite scenes in Emmeline's book was between Jackson and Sage, when the detective assumes they're in a relationship instead of brother and sister, and they just play into it. Jackson's like, oh yeah, hello, like, and it's so funny. I just have to call that out because I really love Jackson. Was like my favorite character in your book, and I have such a soft spot for siblings. And actually, for my answer would be the brother of Parker's brother, Liam, and he's such a hot mess. I just feel like he has a long way to go, but he's redeemable, and you see him. He sort of has this arc, and I love continuing it through the series. And I could write a book about him because he's just so fun, and I'd like to, yeah. He has a lot of room to grow too.
And so I'm seeing, we're seeing lots of Death in Paradise love in the comments too. So people who have tuned in are also big fans. So we're almost out of time, but before we head out tonight, Emmeline, I know that you just had Fresh Brewed Murder come out last week, but what do you have coming up next?
Well, the second book in the series will come out next April. I believe the title will be Double Shot Death. And then I'm working on some other projects, but that's the only one that is official.
And how about you, Kate?
The third book in the Colorado Wine Mystery series is titled Mauled to Death, and that comes out in October 5th. And Parker and company sort of fly the coop and head up to the mountains to a ski resort where they hope to have some fun, but of course nothing goes quite as planned.
So because cozies have such great titles, that's also one of my favorite kind of tropes of the genre, is kind of the great kind of pun-worthy titles. So real quick, let's talk about titles. So how did you guys come up with the titles for yours? Was it kind of publisher help committee thing, or did you come up with them yourselves? Let's start with Kate.
I actually came up with my titles. The thing that changed was the mystery series name. So Colorado Wine Mystery Series, I initially had it as something else, and it's way better now. But the individual titles, Killer Chardonnay and A Pairing to Die For and Mauled to Death, I came up with those. And it was really trying to just think of as punny things as I could with wine and murder. And I love coming up with titles. It's one of my favorite parts about writing the cozy. And I usually have to have the title before I write the cozy because I think it all kind of ties in.
Funny with mine, for the longest time, I called it The Side Hustle because she's a barista whose side hustle is solving murders. But we decided that wasn't cozy enough when we sent my agent and we sent it on submission. And I had a different title initially, and then I ended up writing out like a whole list of coffee pun related titles, and then narrowed it down to ones that I liked and sent them into my publisher, and they told me their top picks, and that was how we chose Fresh Brew Murder.
So
and
thank you, everybody.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh,
the second one?
Oh, and I'll say that it was second, and I assume we'll go the same way for the third, but we will see.
So thank you everybody for joining us this evening. If you came in late, if you missed any part of the chat, once we are done, Facebook and YouTube will archive them so you'll be able to watch them again or check out the parts that you might have missed. Sometimes YouTube takes just a little bit longer to do some encoding steps than Facebook does, but they'll be up pretty quick. And as I mentioned when we got started, if you are Cozy Mystery fans and you want to see more of our virtual cozy events on YouTube, we've got a whole playlist full of all of the events that we've done and also some at-home recommendation videos that we did where I talk about some of my favorites that we did kind of early in the pandemic. So that's all available on the YouTube channel. Wanted to mention tomorrow night, if you like kind of lighter historical mysteries, we're going to be chatting with Erica Ruth Neubauer. Her new book has just come out, so we'll be chatting with her, and Susanna Calkins will be chatting with her. So that's tomorrow night. As I mentioned, we're doing an event with Mia Manansala, Jen McKinley, and Terry Moore and Farley in May, on May 6th. We've got a Kensington Cozy Con virtually coming up in June. So lots of great stuff coming up. Again, I wanted to send a big thank you to Larissa at Kensington for not only sending me some really great questions to keep the chat going tonight, but to also have helped kind of get us this set up and kind of come up with a great theme and bring Kate in. So Larissa, thank you so much for helping us get this set up. And Emmeline, congratulations on the new book. I'm so excited that you're now kind of in the cozy world. And like I said, you know, fingers crossed that we'll actually get to do this in store when the second one comes out.
Yeah.
And Kate, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We'll keep an eye out for the third one. I'm so excited that we got to chat with you this evening as well. So everybody take care and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. It's been a blast.
Bye.